Hey everyone, this morning we hit 2,000 fans on the IceFlow Studios Facebook page over at facebook.com/IceFlowStudios, so definitely head over there, press that like button, and ask your Photoshop question, because today I'll be answering one from there. There were a few people who wanted me to touch on the Dragan effect. Now if you're unfamiliar with this effect, go take a look at Andre Dragan's website. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, it's probably Polish. I'm not, so I have no idea how to pronounce it, but it's spelled ANDRZEJ DRAGAN.com. Andre Dragan. He's a fantastic photographer, and a similar effect to what he does was also used in the movie 300, so you might be a little bit more familiar with that. Now, taking a look at his work, there are definitely a few things that really stand out. The shadows and the highlights are definitely accented. They really pop in some areas. The saturation is toned down in some areas, but stronger in other areas. The sharpness of the image is really cranked up, and the background is usually really dark to bring focus to the foreground subject. So that's what we're going to focus on in this tutorial. So how do we achieve this effect? It's actually quite simple and very fun. Let's take a look at editing this image to get a Dragan type effect. The first thing I'm going to do is apply a shadows and highlights adjustment to my image. This will also allow us to neutralize the image so we can really define our shadows and highlights later on. It's also going to flatten out our subject. Now, even though the shadows and highlights are very defined in the final images, there is a sense of flatness in some areas. I'm going to use 10 and 40 for these values, but use whatever works for you, play around with it and experiment a little bit. Now, before we start adding adjustments, let's go ahead and sharpen up this image. In most of Andre's images, the sharpness is turned up quite a bit. So to do this, let's hop up to our filter menu and turn on Smart Objects. This will allow us to edit our sharpness later on if we have to. Now if we go back up to Filter, then down to Sharpen, then Unsharp Mask, we can go ahead and set the sharpness. For the values, I'm going to use 60, 2, and 0. That'll really give some nice sharpness to this image. Next, we're going to tweak the colors a little bit. With this effect, especially when it comes to faces, I found that there's a lack of red. The faces mainly consist of yellows and blues. By adding a color balance adjustment layer, we're able to control which colors are visible and which ones are toned down a little bit. Once the adjustment is added, we're going to adjust the shadows. The first slider will allow us to suck a lot of the red out of the skin, but it's going to keep the red in the lips, which is what we want. So I'm going to set that value to around -45. And for the last slider, it's going to add some yellow to the skin tone. We don't want a lot of yellow, so I'm going to only use -20 as the value. And again, play around with the values till you get the best result for your images, because your images will probably be different than the one that I'm using. Now you may have noticed that the background has changed pretty dramatically. Now because we have a layer mask on this adjustment layer, I can simply grab a black brush and paint over the background to reveal the original layer. Good. Now we're going to start painting. This is where the shadows and highlights really start to take form. Go ahead and create a new layer and set the blend mode to overlay. This is going to allow our blacks and whites to blend really nicely once we start painting. Now grabbing a soft brush, I'm going to set the opacity of the brush to around 10%. We don't want to overdo our painting. With this set, I'm going to start going around my images and start accenting the current shadows and highlights. I'm painting the light areas with a white brush and the dark areas with a black brush. And you can easily switch between black and white by pressing the X key on your keyboard. When you're painting your shadows and highlights, make sure you really focus on the smaller areas, like in between the lips, around the nose, and the main structure of the face. This is really going to allow your subject to pop in the right areas. Once you finish painting, you may not notice a huge difference, but that's okay. The next few adjustments that we're going to add are going to help bring out those areas. Now let's go ahead and add a curves adjustment layer. I always like to start by adding 3 points to my curve. One in the center, one at the top, and one at the bottom. All you have to do is click in these areas and a point will be added. Once these are in place, dragging the top point upwards will help bring out the highlights in our image, and dragging the bottom point downwards will help bring out the shadows. Now for the middle point, I'm going to increase it only a little bit just to brighten up the other areas of the image. Perfect. It's really starting to take shape. One adjustment we'll definitely need to add is a hue and saturation adjustment. Most of Andre's images aren't very saturated, so what I'm going to do is just decrease the saturation a little bit to around -35%. Now, however, I'm going to use a black brush and paint over the lips because I want the lips to remain a little bit more saturated than the rest of the image. Certain things like lips and items of focus seem to be a little bit more saturated than the rest of the image. The last thing we need to do is darken the background. This will really allow our subject to pop. Go ahead and make another new layer and grab a black brush. Set the blend mode to color burn and the opacity to around 20%. Now all you have to do is just brush over the background. You may have to brush it a few times to really get that background a little bit dark, but once you start brushing, it's really going to bring some contrast between the background and the subject matter at the front. And there you go, that's the color version of the Dragan effect. Now if you want a black and white version, which in my opinion looks a lot better, you can add a black and white adjustment layer and increase the blue and magenta, and then decrease the red and the yellow. So I hope that helps. I think the result looks pretty nice. It's not 100% accurate to Andre's images, but it's certainly getting there. So I hope that helps, and remember, if you have any Photoshop questions, there's a few ways you can ask. Facebook.com/IceflowStudios, Twitter.com/IceflowStudios, or Tutcast.com/ask. Take care.